afternoon, class. And these are examples of crops that we grow in Zambia and the life.
Look at algebraic expression.
Good afternoon, class. My name is Miss Goma, teaching you Agricultural Science Grade 8. We apologize, you're supposed to start with English, but we've started with with Agricultural Science, then English will come after Agricultural Science, okay? Last week, we started a new topic, which was on crop production. We defined what crop production was. We also looked at vegetable groups and their examples. Apart from that, we also learned on the factors that make a site suitable for growing vegetables. We also drew a plan for vegetable growing, okay? So from what we learned last week, we learned on different types of vegetable groups, which is leafy vegetables, rooty vegetables, solanaceous vegetables, cucurbit vegetables, miscellaneous vegetables. Those are examples of vegetables we gave. We also talked about the factors that make a site suitable for growing vegetables. And these factors were away from big trees, source of water, soil fertility, soil depth, and the fence of the garden. Okay, so in today's lesson, we're going to learn on the types of beds that we use in vegetable growing. Apart from the types of beds, we're also going to prepare seedlings before transplanting, what is supposed to be done before you transplant seedlings. And we're also going to define what a weed is. We're also going to know the importance of weed control in the crops and the methods we can use to control weeds, okay? So today's lesson, we're starting with types of beds, types of vegetable beds. Okay, so before you make vegetable beds, last week we learned that factors that you consider before we make these vegetable beds, and those factors were the garden should be fenced, the soil should be fertile. Okay, so how many types of vegetable beds do you know? How many types of vegetable beds do you know? Okay, so the first type is a flat bed. The first type is a flat bed. What is grown? Give me examples of crops that are grown under the flat bed. Okay, so the types of crops that are grown in these flat beds, we have tomatoes, cucumbers, and watermelon. Okay, so when you look at these types, the examples that I've given you that you can grow in under flat beds, tomatoes fall under solanaceous vegetables, cucumber falls under cucurbit vegetables, and watermelon falls under cucurbit vegetables. Okay, so flat beds are usually done within Zambia or within Lusaka. Most of us, for us to grow these kinds of vegetables I've given here, we need to use a flat bed. Okay, so let's go to the next. The raised bed is usually done. Where do you think the raised bed is usually done? So raised beds are usually done where there's a lot of rainfall. Raised beds are usually prepared where there's a lot of rainfall. So raised beds are prepared where there's a lot of rainfall. And what type of crops do we grow in the raised bed? And examples of leafy vegetables, we learned there's cabbage, rape, etc. Okay, so we're saying under raised beds, these beds are usually done where there's a lot of rainfall. And the kind of crops that you grow are leafy vegetables, and examples of leafy vegetables, we've got cabbage, rape, and etc. Okay, so let's go to the third type of bed, the sunken bed. Okay, so where do you prepare these kinds of beds? Where do you prepare these kinds of beds? Okay, so these kinds of beds are prepared where there's low rainfall. They're prepared where there's low rainfall. What type of crops are grown in the sunken bed? What type of crops are grown in the sunken bed? Okay, so the types of crops that are grown under the sunken bed, one, we've got onion. Apart from onion, we've got watermelon. Okay, so these are examples of crops that can be grown under sunken bed. Okay, so after learning on the three types of beds, we also have another type of bed, which is a nursery bed. Okay, so what is a nursery bed? What is the nursery bed? Okay, so a nursery bed, this is a bed where seeds are raised and taken care of. After they've been taken care of, when they mature, they reach in seedlings that are transplanted from the nursery bed to their mother bed. Okay, so I'll define what a nursery bed is. So I'm defining a nursery bed to be, this is a bed where seeds are raised and taken care of. After they are raised, they develop into seedlings. After they develop into seedlings, do here in Zambia or at our school, we make, let's say if we're growing rape, let me say if we're growing rape, we make 2 to 3 beds, which we'll call it as a nursery bed. We'll plant seeds in the furrow ways. After planting the seeds, we'll let the seeds germinate. After they germinate into seedlings, when they're strong enough, we transplant them from the nursery bed to the mother bed. So I'm saying a nursery bed, this is a bed where seeds are taken care of. Not until they develop into seedlings. Then later on, they are transplanted to the mother bed. Okay, so in my definition, there's a term I've used, transplanted. In my definition, there's a term I've used, transplanted. Okay, so what is to transplant? What is to transplant? Okay, so transplant is to remove seedlings from the nursery bed to the mother bed. To transplant is to remove seedlings from the nursery bed to the mother bed. Okay, so these are the types of vegetable beds that we have. So after learning the types of vegetable beds, let us see how we prepare before they're transplanted. How do we prepare these seedlings before they are transplanted? Okay, so what you do is you only transplant seedlings that are strong enough, and the only way you can transplant seedlings is 4 weeks to 6 weeks. Okay, so seedlings are transplanted either 4 weeks, 5th or 6th week when they are strong enough to be transplanted. Okay, so if we say 4 weeks, meaning it's 1 month. If we say 6 weeks, meaning it's 1 month, 2 weeks. Okay, so we're saying you only transplant seedlings when they're strong enough, and they can be transplanted in the weeks 4. Okay, so before you transplant seedlings, the soil has to be hardened off. Before you transplant seedlings, the soil has to be hardened enough. Okay, so what is this hardening of? What is this hardening of? Okay, so hardening off is to reduce the amount of water that we put in our nursery beds. Hardening is to reduce the amount of water that we put in our nursery beds. But why are we hardening off the soil? Why are we hardening off the soil? Okay, I'll give an example. If you used to water your nursery before the seeds germinated, if you used to water your nursery bed before your seeds germinated, maybe you used to water in the morning and in the evenings. We only start watering once, which is in the morning. Why are we doing so? So that the seedlings should get used to the harsh conditions. So that the seedlings should get used to the harsh conditions. Okay, so we're saying we have to harden off. To harden off, meaning reducing the amount of water we put in the nursery bed. Okay, so before we transplant our seedlings from the nursery bed to the mother bed, we have to harden off, meaning reducing the amount of water that we put in the nursery beds. Because when we transplant these seedlings from the nursery bed to the mother bed, the seedlings should get used to the harsh conditions that they'll find in their mother bed. Are we together? So this hardening, it can be done 8 to 10 days. So this hardening off of the soil should be done 8 to 10 days. The 10th day, you can transplant your seedlings because the seedlings are used to the condition, the harsh condition that they're going to find in their mother bed. Okay? So the question comes in to say, what happens when you transplant the seedlings? Okay, so the best time that you can transplant seedlings is in the afternoons. The best time that you can transplant seedlings from the nursery bed to the mother bed is in the afternoons. Why am I saying in the afternoons? Why am I saying in the afternoons? Because in the afternoons, the sunset would have gone, there'll be no sun, so that when you transplant them in the evenings where there's no sun, they'll get used the whole night until the next day, meaning they've gotten used in their mother bed. Are we together? Okay, so after learning on how to transplant and what needs to be done before you transplant seedlings, so there are two things that need to be done. One, you're hardening off the soil, meaning the seedlings should get used to the harsh condition that they're going to find in the mother bed. And before that, you do not transplant seedlings that are not strong enough. You only transplant seedlings that are strong enough so that when they're taken to the mother bed, they're able to withstand. Okay? So after learning on the preparations of the seedlings, let us go to weeds. To weed. Okay. So what is a weed? What is a weed? Can anyone define a weed for me? Can anyone define a weed for me? Okay, so a weed is a plant that grows where it is not needed. A weed is a plant that grows where it is not needed. So I'm saying a weed is a plant that grows where it is not needed. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is when you've grown crops and there's a weed that has grown in that field, you need to remove all the weeds. So you remove weeds from the garden, move weeds from the garden. Okay. So an example I'm going to give of a weed. I'll give an example. I have grown maize. That field is meant for maize. I grow maize in the field. The next time I go back in that field, I find rape. the crop that I have not grown. Are we together? I've grown maize in the field, then I find seedlings of rape in that field, meaning they are weeds, they're not needed. So we're defining a weed to be a plant that grows where it is not needed. So we do not need weeds in our gardens or backyard gardens, okay? So why do you think we do not need these weeds in our garden? So the importance of weed control. The importance of weed control. Why do you think it is important to remove weeds from the field? Why do you think it is important to remove weeds from the field? 1, to reduce the competition of water, sunlight, space, and nutrients, okay? So it is important to remove weeds from our garden because we do not want the crops and the weeds to compete for nutrients, water, sunlight, and space, okay? So the first point, to reduce the competition, of water, site, nutrients, and space. Okay, so for our crops to grow healthy, we need a lot of nutrients, we need a lot of water, we need a lot of sunlight, and we need a lot of space so that all the nutrients are being provided only for the crops. Because if we leave weeds in the garden where the crops are, they will fight for these nutrients. Hence, they'll start growing so bad, they will not look healthy because they're competing, they're fighting for nutrients, and they're fighting for water, okay? So that's our first point. Our second point, weed control helps to prevent pests and diseases. Okay. So the second point, we're saying weed control will help to prevent pests and diseases. What do I mean by this point? What do I mean by this point? Okay? So what I mean is, you conquer with me. When you leave the weeds in the garden, that weeds that will harbor pests. There are weeds that will harbor pests. When they harbor pests, they will attack the crops. When they attack the crops, diseases will be found in the crops. What is to harbor? To harbor is to hide. Huh? So meaning the pests will hide in the weeds. In the process that they will come and attack the crops. When the crops are attacked, meaning the crops will not grow and they will not grow healthy. Okay? So I'm saying to prevent pests so that weeds do not harbor pests. Okay? Let's go to the third point. What's our third point? Okay. I'll give you an example of the third point is that it makes farm operations easy. It makes farm operations easy. Okay. I'll give an example. I have a garden where I've grown my crops, and in that garden there are weeds. Okay? So imagine I want to aerate my garden. I want to aerate my garden using a garden fork. Okay? So a garden fork is a tool, it's a hand tool that is used for aerating the soil. Now imagine in that garden there are weeds. What will happen to my garden fork? My garden fork will be entangled. My garden fork will be entangled, meaning the weeds will be disturbing me as I'm aerating the soil. So the other thing is that when you remove weeds, the work is easier and it's done so fast, okay? So work is easier when weeds are removed. When weeds are removed from the garden, from the garden. Okay, so we're saying work is easier when weeds are removed from the garden. I've given an example of me working with a hand tool known as a garden fork when I want to aerate the soil in the garden. As I'm aerating, if there are weeds, they'll be disturbing me, and meaning my work will be insufficient. I will not finish my work on time. The weeds will be disturbing me. So if we remove the weeds, meaning the work will become easier. So we're going to the fourth point, the fourth importance. Okay, so my fourth importance is that some weeds are poisonous. Some weeds are poisonous. Right? Okay, so if we leave weeds, bear with me. I gave you an example last week talking about mixed farming. I gave you an example last week talking about mixed farming, where we said this is the growing of crops and keeping of livestock. The growing of crops and keeping of livestock. Now, why you leave weeds in the garden? Eh? We leave weeds in the garden. Some weeds are very poisonous that they can kill animals. And an example of a weed I'll give is cannabis. Cannabis. It's a type of marijuana. It's a type of marijuana. This kind of weed can kill animals like cats and dogs. Okay, so I'm saying weeds are very dangerous. It's good we remove them because some of the weeds are poisonous like cannabis. It can kill animals like cats and dogs. So it is important to remove these weeds from our garden. The fifth point, weeds provide shade to our crops. So the fifth point is weeds provide shade to crops. How do they provide shade to crops? Okay, I'll give you an example of grass. An example of weed, which is grass. When you've grown leafy vegetables in the garden and a weed like grass comes in the garden, you concur with me that the length, the weed will be taller than the crops that we've grown. They'll be providing shade to the crops. Okay, so the problem comes in that for crops to grow and to make their own food, they need what? Sunlight, by the process called photosynthesis. Okay, so we're saying for crops to grow, they need sunlight. Okay, so for crops to grow, they need sunlight. Without sunlight, photosynthesis cannot take place. Okay, so and what is photosynthesis? I remember last week we defined what photosynthesis is. We said photosynthesis, this is a process by which plants make their own food. And plants cannot make their own food minus sunlight. Are we together? Okay. So the importance of weed control, one, it is to reduce competition of water, sunlight. The second one, it prevents pests and diseases because some weeds will harbor pests. Then the fourth one there, weeds are poisonous. I've given an example of cannabis, which would will attack cats and dogs. I've also talked about weeds providing shade for the crops because when we grow crops, the crops need sunlight for them to produce their own food by the process called photosynthesis. Okay, so after learning on the importance of weed control, what are the methods of weed control? So methods of weed control. Okay, so what are the methods of weed control? What are the methods of weed control? Okay, so the first method with me is mechanical method. What happens under mechanical method? What happens under mechanical method? Okay, so under mechanical method, this is a kind of method that uses hand tools. This is a kind of method that we use hand tools. Okay, so cultivation is done by using hand tools. So, hand tools. And these hand tools are a slasher and a hoe. Okay, so we have a slasher and a hoe there. Okay, so if we're saying mechanical method is another method that is used to control weeds. So how is this method done? I'm just from saying this method we use slashers and hoes. Okay, so I'll give two examples of where we've grown crops. I'll give two examples where we've grown crops. Okay, so for example, I have grown vegetables, which is lettuce. Or let me say I've grown vegetables like spinach. Then the weeds are still young. When the weeds are still young and the crops in that field, we're going to use a hoe. We're going to use what? A hoe. So when the weeds are still young, we're supposed to use what? A hoe to remove those weeds from the crops that we've grown. Okay. So in my mother tongue, we say ukusekwila. We say ukusekwila. Okay? We say ukusekwila. That's what we say. So a hoe, you can remove weeds using a hoe. As you remove those weeds using a hoe, when the crops are still there and when the weeds are still young. Okay? Let's go. How do you use a slasher? How do you use the slasher? Okay. Bear with me when you have grown crops. Bear with me when you have grown crops. You cannot slash the weeds from the crops when the crops are in the garden. It is not possible. So you only use a slasher when you've harvested your crops from the garden. After you've harvested the crops from your garden, then maybe let's say that those weeds that just germinate after the crops have been harvested, maybe you've not grown anything in that land for so long, the weeds that will germinate. That's when you can use what? A slasher. Okay? So under mechanical, this is a kind of cultivation where you use hand tools. Examples of these hand tools are slashers or hoes. Okay? So let's go to our second method. Let's go to our second method. Let's go to our second method. Our second method is cultural method. Our second method is cultural method. Cultural method. What happens under cultural method? What happens under cultural method? Okay, so what happens under cultural method? We've got burning. Burning is done under cultural method. That's one. Then any other thing that is done under cultural method is hand pulling. Hand pulling is done under cultural method. Then the other thing that is done under cultural method is crop rotation. Crop rotation. And the last thing that happens under cultural method is mulching. Okay. So let's start with burning. Let's start with burning. Hello? That's cut. So let's start with burning. What happens under burning? Okay? So we're having a field that we've not done anything on that field. It's still a virgin land. We're supposed to cut down trees remove all the weeds. After all the weeds have been removed, you let the weeds dry. You let the weeds dry. When they dry, you do what? You burn them. So under burning, meaning you burn the weeds when they are dry. But as you are burning the weeds, do not burn the humus. As you are burning the weeds, do not burn the humus. Why are we saying do not burn the humus? Okay? Last time we explained what humus is and why it is important in crops. So we shouldn't burn the humus because this is where there's high content of nutrients, a lot of dark color in it. It's a best to use when you're growing crops. It improves the soil structure, okay? So when we're burning the weeds, we shouldn't burn too much because when we burn the humus, meaning the soil structure will not be improved, okay? So let's go to the second one. The second one is hand pulling. The second one is hand pulling. Most of us who have got gardens that are not big, like subsistence farmers, those who only grow food for their families, what they usually do, because the piece of land is not big, if the weeds are still small, they'll go in the garden and they'll start pulling out the weeds using their hands, okay? So hand pulling is the removal of weeds using hands, and this can be done only if the weeds are young. Because if the weeds grow, you end up cutting yourselves. You end up causing accidents. So hand pulling is usually done when the weeds are small. Okay? So when the weeds are small and the soil is a bit moist, you can use what? Hand pulling. So hand pulling is the removal of weeds using hands. Okay? So that was the second point that falls under cultural method. Let's go to the third point. Let's go to the third point. The third point says crop rotation. The third point says crop rotation. So what is this crop rotation? In my previous lesson, that was last week on Friday, we learned and defined what crop rotation is. So what is crop rotation? What is crop rotation? Okay? So crop rotation, this is a growing of different crops in a sequence way on the same piece of land. So crop rotation is the growing of crops in a sequence way on the same piece of land. An example I gave last week, we drew a plant for vegetables. We drew a plant for vegetables. Okay, so we said leafy vegetables was the first one. This is a plant that we drew on Friday. Then the legume vegetables was the second one. Then here we had rooty vegetables. Then there we had solanaceous vegetables, okay? So what I have done here, I have rotated the crops. What I've done here, what is happening here, it's a vegetable rotation, okay? So crop rotation, this is a growing of different crops grown in a systematic way on the same piece of land. Like what I've done, you grow leafy vegetables, which is rape. After you harvest, you put legumes there. After you harvest legumes, you come and put rooty vegetables, an example carrot there. After you harvest the carrots, you put solanaceous vegetables. And examples of these solanaceous vegetables were tomatoes. Okay, so this is growing of crops in a systematic way on the same piece of land. Okay, so after defining what crop rotation and what happens under crop rotation, looking at that vegetable plant, we now go to mulching. What is mulching? What is mulching? What is mulching? So mulching, this is applying different layer materials on the soil surface. So mulching, these are layers of materials that are applied on the surface of the soil. I'll give an example of dry grass. Okay? When we cut dry grass, we heap it, we grow vegetables. After vegetables, when just the seedlings are germinating, when the seedlings have germinated, we add a light mulch on top, just a bit of grass, to avoid sunlight, too much sunlight to hit the seedlings, because those seedlings are not yet strong, okay? So apart from that, we do mulch the crops to suppress the weeds that grow faster than crops, okay? So we use mulching to suppress the weeds that grow faster than the crops that we've grown. Apart from suppressing the weeds, mulch is also used to prevent the evaporation of water from the ground, because when we apply water in the ground, or when we put water in the ground, we want that water to last for so long. So mulching is used in so many ways. The other one, it is to help the sunlight to penetrate, less of sunlight to penetrate into the crops that have just germinated, because they're not yet strong. Then the second one, we put mulching to suppress the weeds that grow faster than crops. The other one, it is to prevent the water to evaporate, because we need water to last in the soil or the ground. So that water is used to all parts of the plant, from the roots, stems to the leaves. Okay, so mulching, layer of material, applied on the surface of the soil, Okay, so we're done. The second method, which is cultural method, we've talked about burning, we've talked about handling, we've talked about crop rotation, and we've talked about mulching. Let us go to the third method. Our third method is biological method. Our third method is biological method. What happens under biological method? What happens under afternoon, class. And these are examples of crops that we grow in Zambia and the livestock.
Look at our geographic expression. And these are examples of crops that we grow in Zambia and the livestock. Look at